So it's been well over a year since I did my initial Majora's Mask review, and a lot has changed since then, and I think now is as good a time as any to start reviewing one of the most acclaimed games of all time, Ocarina of Time.
He said it! He said it!
And there are for sure tons of different reasons as to why this game is so praised. This video will be me going through some noteworthy qualities to consider if it's good, and still holds up today. To begin, we must point out one of the most major things that Ocarina had which sets it apart from the rest of the franchise. Its jump to 3D. Because look guys, look! It's one of Ocarina's greatest achievements! Yeah. Z-targeting on the N64! So what did Z-targeting do? Well, it allowed players to more easily ground themselves and focus on objects of importance, from Dekus to NPCs. No longer would a player have to worry about losing sight of a target or just being out of reach to talk. With the handy Z-targeting, the issue kind of faded away. It made fights that you, the player, took feel focused. For example, there is this moment in Dodonga's cavern when some Lizalfos jump down to attack you in this arena where you're positioned on these pillars overlooking this magma. Now, if you don't use the lock-on here, this feels really awkward, because unfortunately Ocarina of Time doesn't particularly have the best camera control. There wasn't a joystick to configure the camera due to the game being on the N64. The most you could do is set the camera behind Link, which could be rather tedious to do, especially in fights. Doubly so if you were playing a 3D game for the first time ever, which Ocarina of Time was many players' firsts. But with the Z-targeting, now the camera would stay on the Lizalfos, keeping both Link and the enemy in frame. This allows the camera to flow more easily towards where all the action is going on, while allowing you to observe your environment and follow and attack enemies. It's a pretty good system, and considering that there was a jump from 2D to 3D, it makes sense that the combat is pretty different as to how it was in 2D. And this isn't a bad thing. In the 2D games, all the enemies were on the same plane, and this meant you couldn't really do an enemy like a pesky bat right. If they had an enemy that would just leave no way to attack them back, bar when they swoop down, it would seem tedious and annoying. But thanks to the jump to 3D, now you can have these lovable assholes swooping down to attack you and making you switch up how you play. Do you roll away while the bat comes towards you and try and ignore its assault? Or do you switch targets to shoot them down with a slingshot? If you do, make sure you move in sync with it. Or maybe you deal with them before aggroing other enemies, making sure these bats disappear as a threat after a little bit of preparation. This extra dimension was handled quite well for its first time, utilising the space provided and introducing a system that made fights with enemies focused in, as opposed to what would have been a robust experience. And when it comes to attacking, there's more to it than just swordplay. It can be simple, or you can use an item to stun them and deal tons of damage. It's a shame when people brush off Ocarina of Time for being filled with waiting, because the game provides a hefty amount of Deku Nuts which can just stun enemies through the defenses, as well as other options. The game does contain a fair bit of waiting and then swinging your sword, but dumbing down everything in the game is pretty disingenuous. It's like saying that the 2D Zeldas were bad because you attack with your sword and then you move out of the way of enemy attacks. Clearly, swinging your sword is the main way of attacking, but you're given plenty of options from a wide selection of items. But the combat isn't the only thing in Ocarina of Time that makes so many fond of it. The major thing I would say is the world building, and how the story is designed for the player is just really incredibly done. Immediately from the start of the game, you're introduced to this wondrous world filled with whimsy with a bit of a gritty edge. Kokiri Forest is filled with friends, and the entire area is a beauty, even in its original form. Following this whimsy theme, you were properly introduced to the Great Deku Tree. It's the strong and powerful guardian of these woods, but this sense of protection that this starting area gave you is dissolved as the Great Deku Tree tasks you to defeat a parasite inside it. Then, to set the stakes into play, you are informed of the foreboding evil that is Ganondorf. His magical prowess formed the parasite in the Great Deku Tree as he demanded the spiritual stone. His magic is dark, and he's set on a path bringing upon parasites, reviving long-gone predators, and infecting worshipped deities with tumors of some kind. If you don't go do your quest, Ganondorf wins. You're a little kid on an epic quest against this big bad guy. You follow directions to find yourself in caves to help the locals with their issues, all in service for your search for the spiritual stones to stop Ganondorf. The journey is fun, and some of the areas in this game really made me stop and look at the area around, just due to how atmospheric it was. Kokiri Forest is a settlement deep in the woods, with their homes being inside tree stumps Their inhabitants are never-aging children with magical fairies, and the music here is childish, which is not too far off from the Lost Woods, which is a bit more mischievous, just like the Skull Kid, or the fact that this section of the woods can claim people and turn them into monsters should they get lost. The ambient track in the Dongo's Cavern really sets up a foreboding atmosphere as you explore the remains of this imposing cave with a huge skull of a greater Dongo, the apex predator of the Goron people, who all live in a cave and eat rocks and dance all day. And if you don't like them, maybe the cool aquatic Zora's Domain might be more your style, especially since there is this waterfall here, and one of the best tracks in the entire game. And all of this is only when you're a child. The game has Link grow to an adult with areas that reflect the fact that you're older and no longer messing around on a silly little quest. The exit from the Temple of Time exemplifies this. You see the malformed sky, the howling winds, you worry for the safety of those people that were living their day-to-day lives. The bustling city that was filled with quests, what happened to them? These people could have been part of your routine, visiting the Happy Mask salesman every time you pass by. You worry, and then when you enter the city square, the only thing there are re-deads, monsters, creatures that act like zombies. This darker tone is reflected in the dungeons, as they get much more complex and foreboding. And speaking of dungeons, starting from the very beginning, the Great Deku Tree is a great first dungeon for the first 3D Zelda. And while it does suffer from this fact, considering that some of the puzzles are really simple, like just shooting an eye and then walking through a door, it is also really good at introducing the concept of an environment that you have to be vigilant of to a first-time player, making sure they realise that some puzzles will have you looking all over the place, that aren't just on the floor like in the previous games. You do have to remember that Ocarina of Time was one of the first 3D adventure games ever, but even then, this dungeon introduces a vertical aspect to the board. The Great Deku Tree requires you, the player, to climb up and scale the tree. It is expanding on the dungeons in a way never done before, and jumping down from the top of the dungeon to break the web and head further down really makes the dungeon feel reactive to your actions. Yes, I'm glazing the web.
Oh, I love you,
Web. Or take one of the most controversial dungeons in this game, the Water Temple. If you remove the issue that I'll get into later, the Water Temple turns into a really fun dungeon. The water level needs adjusting, and there are 3 different levels the water can rise to. Different levels means rooms will switch between having water filled inside them and not. You have to open up pathways by adjusting the water in a way which is really fun. Too bad the dungeon is let down by the iron boots and the boss. But beating dungeons isn't just a reward in itself, since your actions actually help the characters you come across. But a sense of positive change wouldn't matter if the characters were uninteresting or boring. Zelda games are known for having memorable and quirky characters. Ocarina of Time was the start of this trend. The art style allows even one-off characters like the Bazaar Guy to be memorable. Zoras and Gorons are distinct creatures you could easily recognize, and the important characters are designed like this as well. There is Malon, the girl from Lon Lon Ranch, who grows up and works at the stables. She has red hair that she seems to grow into. There is Malon's father, Talon, who looks like a fantasy version of Mario. He's a fat, lazy man, and he's a terrible father, leaving his daughter out in Castletown while he sleeps after delivering shipments. The Happy Mask salesman, who is this character that is nearly always smiling, but he has a low tolerance for people who don't pay him what he is owed. Compare any of these characters to previous characters in Zelda, like Link's uncle in Link to the Past, a one-off character who dies. Now, I haven't shown him yet, but just try and picture what Link's uncle could look like. He's a strong, capable knight who took care of Link in these games. He looks like this. It doesn't stand out at all to these other designs, and honestly, it couldn't. And I wasn't trying to, because of course it can't. This was a game where you could count the pixels on Link. Meanwhile, Ocarina of Time has a much bigger canvas for what can be done. These characters can be more pronounced, and it's brilliant that they are. They're fun, charming and great designs that have been replicated in some way for the later entries. There are certain issues that Ocarina of Time faces, of course. The game is by no means utterly perfect. For one, the simpler obstacles like the spiraling spikes are much more of an issue in this game than in any previous one. If you don't have their movement visualized, it can cause you to getting attacked off guard, which can seem rather unfair, as these spikes are fast moving, and and sometimes completely out of camera hidden behind walls. There is normally a warning from Navi, but the game's lack of camera control means that if you want to check behind a wall for upcoming spikes, you've got to stare at the wall and then lock behind Link, which can be rather tedious. There is also signs of the game showing its age, like the way you configure your items and equipment being kind of obtuse. The menu you use is slow, and while this isn't an issue most of the time, it becomes literal hell when you get to the water temple, because the iron boots, the item essential for the water temple that is used to sink to the bottom of the water, is not classified as an item, but equipment. This means every time you want to float or sink, you have to go into your menu and equip or unequip the iron boots. This was fixed on the 3DS version and on the unofficial PC port Ship of Harkinian, but the initial version of the game still had this monster of an experience. It made the dungeon insufferable. Then the final thing I would consider to be a flaw is how slow the game can be. The cutscenes the game has can take forever. There's no option to skip them if you're on your third playthrough, and I'm not expecting the game to remember every time you've played, but the Great Deku Tree literally wants to ask if you want to hear what he has to say, and you can say no when he still talks. And speaking of the Great Deku Tree, you have to listen to him talking about the creation of Hyrule in an unskippable cutscene. Zelda also does pretty much the same thing. There are plenty of cutscenes that don't overstay their welcome, like Ganondorf talking to Link, but a lot of the dialogue from the Forces of Good can take way too long. Old Man Rauru takes for ages to tell you that time has passed, ironically, and then Sheik does the exact same. There are plenty of instances like this where the game gets tedious with the amount of dialogue that gets thrown your way. I understand that this is a story game, but on subsequent playthroughs the long cutscenes get stale real quick. The only exception, I would say, to long cutscenes getting stale would be King Zora. I think the King Zora gag is hilarious. You're ironically just forced to watch him slowly shuffle to the side. You don't need to press the A button non-stop to mash through the dialogue, there isn't any here. He's just slowly moving. It's funny. But for the cutscenes, if only there was a way to skip them. In the modern age, there is a lot of different ways you can play Ocarina of Time. Because surprise, most of what I've been showing you isn't actually native N64 footage. There are remasters and community-made mods and ports which can do a lot for this game to look better. The 3DS version of Ocarina of Time updates the models, adding detail and lighting to the game, making everything much higher quality, and is honestly my preferred way of playing Ocarina. Has a much more vibrant art style, which seems to be much more akin to the initial artwork that Ocarina of Time was based on, as opposed to the initial hardware. And this vibrance honestly serves it rather well. With Castletown specifically, the brightness has a positive effect, making the place much more outstandingly shiny and beautiful to look at. I personally prefer this look, especially since the poorly aged pre-rendered backdrops have been replaced with a 3D space. This looks more appealing, and it allows the camera usage where it previously was unavailable. Its brightness also serves to juxtapose the time periods going from this to this. However, there are points to be made about the areas which seem to have been made too bright that lose the point of the area. The Shadow Temple shouldn't be this bright, and the final fight against Ganondorf, in my opinion, lost all of its initial charm. You would only be able to make out Ganondorf fully when lightning struck. He was bathed in the shadow and stood out against the background. The 3DS version decided to just ignore this very cool lightning moment though, and instead just have Ganondorf completely visible at all times, losing that atmosphere completely. On a fixing side though, the 3DS version heavily improved the water temple. Firstly, by making the iron boots an item which can be turned off and on, and secondly, made the dungeon much more explained in a way which wasn't really dumbing down the initial dungeon, but just clearing up some confusion. Now, the chambers that change the water levels are labelled to show the level which the water would change to. That's a tongue twister, isn't it? Making it much more easy to understand how the dungeon works. I can't cry at the dungeon. This changed the water temple from a maze with no sign of escaping which punished every mistake, to a well-designed complex dungeon that was a fun challenge. Boss still sucks. Then you do have the option of playing the game as it was on the N64. You could play it on an N64. Good luck finding one. Or you can use an emulator. With a nifty little emulator, you can configure the game as much as you want. Add a CRT and some scan lines, and those garish pre-rendered backdrops blend right in. You also have the PC port Ship of Harkinian, which cuts out the middleman of emulation. No longer does your PC have to operate as an N64 to run the game. Now the game can just be natively ran. There are lots of quality of life features like bug fixes and even ways to make the game speed up, as well as options for randomizers and other customizations, which are really cool, as well as tons of mods like texture packs that make the game look amazing, with one of them making all the models look like they were from the 3DS version. But do keep in mind that the Ship of Harkinian mods are community made, which means who knows? There could be ray tracing that I'm not aware of. Unfortunately, you don't have the Majora's Mask mod, so I guess it kind of sucks. So is Ocarina of Time a good game? Yeah, it isn't even really that controversial of a take. The game was a pioneer for 3D adventure games, and the rest of the Zelda games as a whole. There are of course some flaws, but it's a great adventure game with an epic story, and bosses that are still memorable to this day. Took the game from 2D to 3D in the best possible way I can imagine. There are obviously going to be preferences for every person, with some people just preferring the 2D style of Zelda that Link to the Past made great, but that doesn't make Ocarina of Time bad. Ocarina of Time is one of the most influential games ever. I keep saying this, but a lot of the things it introduced are still used to this day. The lock-on system was used in all the Soulsborne games, and in those games, even with the advent of a functioning camera that works off a joystick, people will still opt to use the lock-on system. Anyway, I'm gonna go back to playing randomizers while I work on my next video. So yeah, that's the video. I'm planning on making an Ocarina of Time versus Majora's Mask video. I don't know, next year maybe? I'm joking.